I rescued a wounded Apache girl, and now she says I'm her husband. White heavy check mark. The man rode slowly along a narrow trail, his horse picking its way carefully over the rocky path. He was a lone traveler, a man who had spent much of his life in the wilderness, and he knew the land well. The quiet of the canyon was familiar, almost comforting, but today it felt different. There was a tension in the air, a faint sense that something was not quite right. As he rounded a bend, he heard a faint, almost unnoticeable sound, a soft, trembling cry. At first he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him, or perhaps a small animal in distress. But then it came again, more clearly this time, a human cry of pain and fear. His heart quickened. He had learned long ago to trust such instincts in the wild. Something or someone was in trouble. He guided his horse carefully off the trail and into a small clearing. The cry grew louder, more desperate. Then he saw her. She was lying on the ground near a cluster of rocks, partially hidden by the shadows. She was young, no more than a teenager, with dark hair tangled and matted and her clothes torn and dirty. Blood stained her arm and leg, and she shivered from either pain or fear, or perhaps both. Her eyes, wide with terror, flicked toward him as he approached, but she did not move. It was clear she was too weak to even speak. The man dismounted slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. "It's all right," he said softly, though he knew she might not understand his words. "I won't hurt you." He studied her carefully. Her breathing was shallow and she seemed barely conscious. He could see bruises forming on her face and arms, and the way she clutched her side suggested a deeper wound. Time was critical. If he did not act quickly, she might not survive until morning. He pulled his horse closer and tied it to a nearby tree. Then carefully, he knelt beside her, assessing her injuries. He had no proper medical supplies, only a few bandages, some cloth, and basic herbal remedies he had learned from years in the wilderness. He worked quickly, cleaning the blood and applying what little he could to stop the bleeding. She flinched at first, but he spoke gently, trying to reassure her with a calm tone. She did not speak, but her trembling lessened slightly. When he finished, he looked around. Night was falling fast, and the canyon would become dangerous in the dark. He needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere he could tend to her without interruption. He considered carrying her on foot, but she was too heavy, and the trail was too rough. Then he remembered his horse. He could lift her gently onto its back, taking care not to aggravate her injuries. It would be uncomfortable for both of them, but it was the only choice. He murmured again, softly, so she might sense his intentions even if she did not understand his words. Then, with careful strength, he lifted her, supporting her fragile body as best as he could, and positioned her across the saddle. The horse shifted nervously but accepted the load. Slowly, they began the journey down the canyon trail. The girl did not speak, did not even seem to breathe deeply at first, but every so often she let out a soft, pained sigh. The man kept talking to her, describing what he was doing, telling her stories of his travels, anything to calm her. He hoped she would understand the tone of his words even if the language itself was foreign. After a while she relaxed slightly, leaning a little more on his support, and that small gesture filled him with relief. The ride was slow and careful. Every step the horse took over the rocky path could cause her pain, but he could not risk stopping too long in the open. The canyon was wild, home to predators and dangerous terrain alike. His thoughts raced as he guided the horse, thinking of how to get her to safety and how to care for her once they arrived. He had a small cabin several miles away, simple and isolated, but it had a roof, warmth, and privacy, enough for her to recover. As darkness settled fully over the canyon, the wind carried with it strange, distant sounds. Owls hooted from hidden perches, and the night creatures moved quietly among the rocks and trees. He stayed alert, scanning the shadows, his hand resting near the knife at his belt, ready if danger approached. But for now, the only pressing danger was the girl's fragile life. Every step the horse took was a careful negotiation between safety and speed, and he guided it as smoothly as he could. Eventually, the clearing ahead opened into a small plateau where the moonlight fell gently on a modest wooden cabin. The man exhaled a quiet sigh of relief. They had made it. Carefully, he helped the girl off the horse and guided her inside. He lit a small fire in the hearth, letting the warmth wash over her as he worked to clean her wounds more thoroughly. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and she tried to sit up, but he gently pushed her back onto a blanket on the floor, murmuring words of reassurance. For hours, he tended to her, using herbal poultices and clean cloth to dress her injuries. He spoke in quiet tones, telling her that she was safe now, that no harm would come to her under his care. She stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes, but did not resist. By the time he finally allowed himself to rest, she had fallen into a fitful sleep, her breathing still uneven but steadier than before. As he watched her, he could not help but wonder about her story. Who had done this to her? Why was she alone in the canyon, so young and vulnerable? He had rescued many animals and travelers in his life, but rescuing a human, especially a child of another culture, carried weight he had not expected. The thought of returning her to her people loomed in his mind, but for now, survival came first. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees again, but inside the cabin there was only quiet. The man settled near the fire, keeping one eye on the girl, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep, unspoken connection. She was fragile, yes, but there was a spark in her, a strength that shone through even in her weakened state. He felt a responsibility that went beyond mere duty. It was something more primal, something that demanded care and protection. He reflected on the day, on the strange twist of fate that had brought her into his life. The canyon was a harsh, unforgiving place, but somehow it had delivered her to him. And in that delivery, he felt a strange sense of purpose, as though their meeting had been written in the very landscape itself. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, he sat quietly, listening to her soft breathing. Night deepened, and the world outside grew still. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope, not just that she would survive, but that perhaps this strange encounter might lead to something more profound. In the wilderness, life was unpredictable, dangerous, and fleeting. Yet in the quiet warmth of the cabin, amidst the flickering light of the fire, a small seed of trust and connection had begun to grow. And so, as the night wore on, he remained vigilant, keeping her safe, guarding her with an unwavering attention that neither he nor she fully understood yet. One thing was clear: he would not allow harm to come to her, not tonight, not ever if he could help it. For in rescuing her, he had unknowingly stepped into a story far larger than either of them could imagine, a story that was only just beginning. The morning sun crept through the small windows of the cabin, painting the room in soft golden light. The girl stirred slightly, blinking against the brightness, her dark hair falling across her face. She looked around, her eyes cautious, and for a moment it seemed she was unsure if she was safe. But then she saw him, the man who had rescued her, sitting nearby, tending to a small fire. Relief softened her features and she tried to smile, though the effort caused a small wince of pain. He noticed immediately and leaned closer, gently touching her shoulder. "Take it easy," he said softly. "Don't push yourself." His voice carried a warmth that had grown over the hours they had spent together. She did not answer in words, but her eyes held a quiet acknowledgement. She was learning slowly to trust him, though the walls around her heart were still strong. The cabin was simple, but it was warm and secure. A rough blanket covered her, and a small pile of herbs and clean cloth lay nearby. He had spent the night listening to her breathing, watching over her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He attended her wounds as best he could with what he had: bandages, herbs, and a steady hand. It was not perfect, but it was enough to stabilize her. Breakfast was a simple affair. He brought her water and some dried meat, carefully cutting it into small pieces so she could manage. She took the food slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it. He sat beside her, speaking quietly, explaining each step. "Eat slowly," he said. "You need your strength." She looked at him, her dark eyes curious and wary. Slowly, she nodded and began to eat, taking small, careful bites. As she ate, he observed her closely. She was young but strong in ways that surprised him. Even with her injuries, there was a determination in her eyes, a spirit that refused to be broken. He wondered about her life before this moment, what had led her to be alone and wounded in the canyon. He wanted to ask, to understand, but he knew words might not come easily, and he could not risk frightening her. The morning passed slowly. He cleaned the cabin, prepared more herbal remedies, and encouraged her to rest. She did not speak much, but she began to move more confidently, testing her strength. When she tried to lift her arm, a sharp pain shot through her and she cried out softly. He rushed to her side, holding her gently. "Easy," he said. "Take it slow." She looked at him, startled by his care, and then her expression softened. She realized that he would not force her, that he would let her heal at her own pace. Days passed and her strength began to return. She could sit for longer periods, feed herself without assistance, and even walk a few steps with his support. During this time, communication between them remained limited. She spoke little, and he knew only a few words of her language. Yet they found ways to understand each other. A nod, a gesture, a look, these small signs became their conversation. Slowly, a bridge of trust was built, spanning the gap between their worlds. He noticed the small details of her personality. She had a sharp mind, observing everything around her. She noticed the birds outside the window, the patterns of the fire, the way the wind moved through the trees. She would point, gesture, or make small sounds to express her thoughts, and he would respond, trying to learn her meaning. The process was slow, sometimes frustrating, but it brought them closer. One afternoon, as he helped her to the small wooden chair by the window, she made a sound that seemed almost like a word. He tilted his head, listening carefully. "What is it?" he asked gently. She repeated the sound, and though he did not understand, he smiled encouragingly. It was progress. She was beginning to trust enough to communicate, to reach out in the only way she could. Their days fell into a quiet routine. She would rest, he would prepare food and tend the fire. They would sit together in silence, the occasional small sound or gesture creating a bond that neither had anticipated. There were moments of laughter, too, small, spontaneous bursts of joy when a bird landed near the cabin, or when she tried to mimic one of his gestures. These moments were precious, brief glimpses of normalcy in a life that had been marked by fear and pain. As she grew stronger, he began teaching her small tasks, how to fetch water from the nearby stream, how to gather firewood safely, and how to prepare simple meals. She was quick to learn, her movements careful but precise. Sometimes she would falter, wincing from pain, and he would steady her with a gentle hand. She began to rely on him not just for care, but for guidance and protection. And in return, he found himself increasingly aware of her presence, her needs, and the quiet intelligence she carried. One evening, as the sun sank low, casting a warm glow across the cabin, she reached out her hand toward him. It was tentative, uncertain, but the gesture carried meaning. He took her hand gently, holding it in his own. For a moment, they simply sat, hands touching, sharing a silent connection that words could not capture. He realized that she was no longer just a wounded girl he had rescued. She was becoming someone important in his life, someone he cared for deeply. Her recovery was not without setbacks. There were moments of pain, when her wounds flared or when she became frightened by the smallest sounds outside. Each time, he was there, soothing, comforting, and protecting her. And each time, her trust in him deepened. She began to smile more, to relax in his presence, and to show small signs of the person she had been before the attack. He also began to learn more about her, slowly piecing together fragments of her story through gestures and broken words. She spoke of her home, of the land she had come from, of the people she loved. Though he could not understand every word, he sensed her longing, her connection to a world beyond the cabin. He respected this, never pushing her, always letting her share at her own pace. One night, as they sat by the fire, she made a sound that he did not recognize, but it carried weight. She looked at him, her eyes serious, and repeated it. He tilted his head, unsure of its meaning. She gestured toward herself and then toward him, making the sound again. Something in the tone in her eyes told him it was important. He realized she was saying something about them, about a bond he did not yet understand. He nodded slowly, trying to show respect, though he did not fully grasp the meaning. She smiled faintly, as if satisfied that he had understood at least part of her intention. The moment lingered in the cabin, quiet and powerful, a turning point in their relationship. He felt a new responsibility, not just to care for her wounds, but to honor whatever connection she was expressing. The following days were filled with continued recovery and subtle lessons. She began to move more freely, even venturing outside the cabin for short walks. He stayed close, ensuring her safety, guiding her steps, and offering quiet encouragement. She observed the world around her with keen eyes, fascinated by the small changes in nature, the way the sunlight danced through the trees, and the sounds of the wild creatures at night. Through it all, their bond deepened. She began to rely on him not only for care but for companionship, and he, in turn, found himself caring for her in ways he had never imagined. He admired her strength, her resilience, and the quiet wisdom that belied her years. In the simplicity of daily life, a profound connection was growing, a bond formed through trust, patience, and mutual respect. By the end of the second week, it was clear that she was stronger, more confident, and more aware of her surroundings. She moved with purpose, communicated with more clarity, and showed a playful side that had been hidden beneath fear and pain. He watched her with a mixture of pride and awe, understanding that their journey together was only beginning. And then, one quiet evening, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced across the walls, she looked at him with a seriousness that made him pause. She spoke again in her own language, repeating the words she had used before. This time her gaze was steady, and there was a certainty in her tone. Though he did not understand the words fully, he sensed their meaning carried importance, a declaration that he could not ignore. He leaned closer, listening carefully, and realized that this was more than simple communication. She was expressing something profound, something that spoke of trust, connection, and perhaps even a bond that went beyond words. The weight of it settled over him, a mixture of surprise, responsibility, and an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. For the first time since he had found her in the canyon, he truly understood that their lives were intertwined in ways he had not anticipated. She was no longer just a wounded girl in need of care. She was someone who had chosen, in her own way, to place her trust and future in his hands. And he, in turn, knew that he would honor that trust, whatever it might mean for the days to come. The night grew deep and the fire burned low. She lay on her blanket, now resting peacefully, and he sat nearby, watching over her as he had done countless times before. Yet now there was a new understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. In the quiet of the cabin, amidst the flickering light and gentle shadows, the first seeds of something extraordinary had been planted, a connection born from compassion, trust, and the simple act of saving a life. Outside, the wind whispered through the canyon once more, carrying with it the promise of new challenges, new discoveries, and a journey that neither of them could yet imagine. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and the beginning of a bond that would shape their lives in ways both profound and unexpected. The days grew longer, and the girl's recovery continued steadily. She was no longer weak or afraid to move about, and the cabin that had once been a place of fear and uncertainty had become a small world she could explore. She walked carefully around the room, examining the furniture, the fire, and the small items the man had brought with him. Her curiosity was constant, and though she could not yet speak fluently in his language, her gestures, expressions, and small sounds conveyed her thoughts clearly. The man noticed how attentive she was, always observing the smallest details. He began to teach her some of his ways, the ways of the wilderness, of survival, and of daily life in the cabin. He showed her how to gather firewood without cutting herself, how to clean the small stream water so it was safe to drink, and how to set simple traps for small animals. She learned quickly, her hands steady and her movements precise. Her intelligence and focus impressed him. But he also began learning from her. She taught him her own ways, though slowly, through gestures, small drawings in the dirt, and mimed actions. He learned about her customs, the ways she and her people respected the land, the animals, and the spirits of the world around them. He discovered the importance of certain plants, the meaning of simple ceremonies, and the careful balance her people maintained with nature. Sometimes she would laugh softly when he tried to mimic her gestures incorrectly, and he would smile in return, appreciating her patience and gentle correction. Evenings were the quietest part of their days, when they sat near the fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood. She would point to the flames, moving her hands to show shapes and patterns, and he would try to follow, learning the small signs of her language. Slowly, a system of understanding emerged between them, one built not on words alone, but on attention, respect, and shared experience. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Despite this growing connection, misunderstandings occurred. Sometimes she would grow frustrated when he could not understand her intentions, or when he acted in ways that went against her customs. Once, she had placed certain herbs around the cabin in a protective pattern, and he had moved them without realizing their purpose. She had looked at him with wide eyes, clearly shocked, and then turned away, frowning. He realized he had made a mistake, and he spent hours carefully replacing the arrangement exactly as she had shown him. She watched silently, and when it was correct, she nodded and smiled faintly. That small smile carried more meaning than words ever could. It was forgiveness, trust, and approval all at once. Over time, the girl became more confident in her movements and more expressive in her gestures. She began to teach him more about her past, her family, and the dangers that had brought her to the canyon. She spoke of people who had not been kind, of moments that had caused fear and pain. Though he could not understand every word, he understood the emotions behind them: anger, sadness, fear, and a deep longing for safety. He never interrupted, never pressed for explanations he could not comprehend. Instead, he listened with patience, offering comfort through touch, tone, and attention. Their relationship grew in subtle ways. He began noticing the small habits she had developed: how she tilted her head when curious, how she frowned slightly when concentrating, and how she would glance toward him when unsure or scared. She, in turn, observed him closely, noting the way he handled tools, the care with which he treated the fire, and the gentle way he moved around her. They had become a team, partners in survival and understanding, though neither had spoken the words that might describe their feelings. One afternoon, as he was showing her how to identify edible plants near the cabin, she suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed toward a small bush. She made a series of gestures, clearly trying to communicate something important. He knelt beside her, examining the plant carefully. Through gestures and patient attention, he realized she was teaching him not just the plant's usefulness, but also its sacred meaning in her culture. It was a small, simple lesson, yet it carried weight. He nodded in understanding, acknowledging the depth of what she had shared. She smiled briefly, pleased that he had understood her intentions. But with understanding came complexity. As he learned more about her culture, he also became aware of the delicate balance between respect and intrusion. He had saved her life, but now he had to navigate the intricate boundaries of her customs. One evening, she became quiet and distant, sitting near the window and staring at the fading light. He sensed her unease and approached gently, careful not to disturb her. She made a series of gestures pointing toward herself, then toward him, and finally clasped her hands together. He watched intently, realizing that she was expressing something significant, something that involved both of them. The realization struck him slowly. He had come to care for her deeply, yet he understood that her declaration carried meanings beyond his immediate comprehension. In her culture, such gestures could signify commitment, trust, or a bond that was sacred. He felt a mixture of surprise, responsibility, and awe. He could not respond in words, but he nodded slowly, showing respect and acknowledgement. She studied his expression carefully and then allowed herself a faint smile, as if satisfied that he had understood, at least in part, the importance of what she had communicated. The next few days were filled with both joy and tension. She grew more comfortable in the cabin, exploring the surroundings with confidence and curiosity. She mimicked his actions in small, playful ways, teasing him lightly when he made mistakes or clumsily handled an object. He laughed with her, enjoying the moments of lightheartedness, yet he remained acutely aware of the weight behind her gestures and words. There was a line between friendship and commitment, between care and respect, that he knew he had to navigate carefully. One morning, as the sun rose over the canyon, she approached him with a small bundle of herbs she had gathered. She placed it carefully on the table and gestured toward herself, then toward him, and finally made the sound she had repeated before. He watched intently, realizing she was reaffirming her earlier declaration. She was choosing him in her own way as someone important, someone bound to her by trust, and perhaps by a cultural tradition he was only beginning to understand. He felt a mixture of emotions, honor, responsibility, and uncertainty. He respected her choice, yet he was acutely aware of the challenges that lay ahead. Their worlds were different, shaped by separate customs, experiences, and expectations. Yet here, in this small cabin in the wilderness, they had forged a connection that transcended those differences. He nodded slowly, acknowledging her declaration without fully understanding all the cultural weight it carried. She looked at him with wide eyes, then relaxed, her body language conveying relief and trust. As the days continued, he took care to respect her space, to honor the lessons she had shared, and to demonstrate through action his commitment to her well-being. He taught her practical skills, yes, but also demonstrated patience, gentleness, and attention. In return, she continued to teach him her ways, deepening his understanding of her culture, her traditions, and the values that guided her life. Even in quiet moments, their bond grew. She would sit beside him at the fire, observing his movements, or mimic his actions with small variations that made him smile. He would respond in kind, sometimes playfully, sometimes with gentle guidance. Through these interactions, they learned more about each other than words could ever convey. Their connection was subtle yet profound, built on shared experience, mutual respect, and a growing sense of trust. One evening, as the stars began to appear in the clear night sky, she pointed upward and made a sound that seemed almost like a question. He followed her gaze and then realized she was asking about the constellations, about the stories behind the stars. He explained what he knew, using gestures and pointing, and she listened attentively, occasionally nodding or adding her own sounds and gestures. They shared the moment in quiet awe, understanding that even in the vastness of the world, they had found a small universe in each other's company. Through these shared experiences, the man realized that their relationship had evolved far beyond simple rescue and recovery. She had chosen him in her way as someone to trust, to guide her, and perhaps to stand beside her in life. And he, in turn, found himself deeply committed to her, not out of obligation, but because of the bond they had built through care, understanding, and shared experiences. Yet challenges remained. The world outside the cabin was unpredictable and dangerous. The canyon held unknown threats, and their cultural differences could complicate interactions with others. But for now, within the warmth of the cabin, they had found a safe space, a place where trust could grow and where two lives, once strangers, were now intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. And so, as night deepened and the fire burned low, they sat together in quiet companionship. She leaned slightly against him, and he allowed her to, offering silent protection and acknowledgement. Words were unnecessary. The trust and bond between them spoke louder than anything that could be said. In that small cabin, in the middle of a vast and sometimes cruel wilderness, they had found each other, and in doing so, had begun a journey that would test their courage, their understanding, and their hearts in ways neither could yet imagine. The sun rose slowly over the canyon, casting long, golden beams across the rugged landscape. The cabin had grown quiet, as if holding its breath. Outside, the wilderness stretched endlessly, wild and beautiful, but the peace they had known inside the small wooden cabin was about to face its first serious challenge. Word had begun to spread. The girl's family, deeply concerned for her safety, had sent scouts to search the surrounding lands. Nearby settlements were talking, too, wary of the unknown and cautious of outsiders. Rumors traveled faster than the wind in these parts, and before long, the man knew that the calm sanctuary of the cabin could not remain untouched. The girl had grown stronger in recent days, and her confidence had returned. She moved gracefully around the cabin, collecting water, tending the fire, and helping with the small meals. Yet there was a tension in her posture, a quiet alertness that spoke of unease. She had begun to glance toward the horizon more frequently, as if expecting someone to appear. The man noticed these moments, understanding without words that she feared her family, or perhaps her past, might come to reclaim her. He had long since learned to respect her instincts and her wisdom, and so he remained vigilant. Every sound outside, every rustle of leaves, caused him to pause and listen carefully. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was also unpredictable. Predators roamed the land, both animal and human. He had rescued her, yes, but now the challenge was different. Protecting her from those who might misunderstand their situation, from those who might see him as a threat rather than a protector. The day began like any other, with small tasks and shared moments of learning. He taught her how to identify safe plants further along the creek, and she taught him more of her customs, showing the importance of certain herbs and explaining, through gestures, their meaning in her culture. They were a team, moving together with ease and understanding, each learning from the other. Yet beneath the calm, there was a growing tension neither could ignore. Late that afternoon, while she collected water from the stream, a faint rustle echoed through the trees behind them. Both froze, instinctively turning toward the sound. Shadows moved among the bushes, and the man immediately signaled for her to stay close. She obeyed without hesitation, stepping behind him and allowing him to shield her. From the shadows emerged a group of scouts, cautious but determined. Their eyes were wary and their hands rested lightly on their weapons, not out of immediate hostility but out of concern and caution. The girl tensed, her eyes widening. She recognized the people immediately, though she did not speak aloud. Her fingers trembled as she gestured toward the man, indicating that he had been her protector, the one who had kept her safe. The scout's leader, a tall man with a weathered face, stepped forward. He spoke in her language, asking questions rapidly, his tone both stern and anxious. She answered with quick gestures, pointing to the man and then to herself, clearly explaining that he had saved her life. The man stepped forward cautiously, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He did not speak their language fluently, but he hoped his calm demeanor and the gestures they had begun to share with the girl would convey his intentions. Slowly, the scouts began to understand. Their expressions shifted from suspicion to cautious acceptance, though the tension in their eyes did not fully fade. They had come with concern, seeking the safety of the girl, and now they were faced with a situation more complex than they had anticipated. The girl remained close to the man, her small hand brushing against his sleeve for reassurance. She looked at him with a mixture of trust and determination. In her eyes, he was no longer just a rescuer. He was her protector, her companion, and in her culture, perhaps something more profound. The man felt the weight of her gaze, understanding that their bond would now be tested not just by circumstance, but by the scrutiny of others. Over the next few hours, conversations, mostly through gestures and simple words, unfolded. The scouts wanted to know where she had been, what had happened, and why she was here. The girl's explanations were careful, precise, and honest, though limited by her young vocabulary. The man supported her silently, showing respect and patience. He demonstrated through actions that he had done nothing to harm her and that his sole intention had been to protect her in a moment of danger. Eventually, the leader of the scouts turned to him directly. Though he did not understand every word, he sensed the underlying message. We must ensure her safety and honor our ways. Who are you to her? The question carried weight. The man hesitated, knowing that his answer would carry implications far beyond mere words. Then he gestured toward the girl, then to himself, and gave a slow, respectful nod. It was the truth. He had rescued her, protected her, and now, by her choice and her culture, he was bound to her in a way that deserved respect. The scouts looked to the girl for confirmation. She stepped forward, her movements steady and confident. She placed her hand on his arm and then made the gesture she had used before, declaring him as her husband according to her customs. The words themselves were simple, but the meaning was profound. In that moment, the scouts' eyes widened, some with surprise, others with cautious acceptance. They had expected a rescue, but not this, a declaration of bond and trust that transcended their initial concerns. The leader of the scouts paused, then nodded slowly. He studied the man carefully, noting his calm demeanor, his attentive care of the girl, and the evident trust between them. After a long moment, he spoke again, his tone softer. "You have saved her life and respected her ways," he said, roughly translating to the man as best he could. "That must be honored, but you must understand our customs and our people. You will need to follow certain rules while she is with you." The man nodded respectfully, recognizing the importance of these boundaries. Though he had not fully understood all the traditions, he knew that respect was paramount. He would learn, he would follow, and he would continue to protect her, just as he had from the moment he first found her in the canyon. The girl, sensing the tension ease, smiled faintly, her hand brushing against his sleeve in a quiet gesture of reassurance. Over the next few days, the scouts remained nearby, observing and ensuring the girl's safety. The man welcomed their presence, understanding that it was a part of her culture and a necessary step in maintaining trust. He continued teaching her practical skills, while also learning more about her customs, language, and the intricate balance between her world and his own. She, in turn, guided him gently, correcting his mistakes and showing him the proper way to honor her traditions. The experience brought both challenges and growth. The man had to adjust to the scrutiny and to the expectations placed upon him. He learned patience, humility, and the importance of observing before acting. The girl, meanwhile, grew more confident in expressing herself, guiding him with quiet authority and demonstrating that trust was not simply given. It was earned and maintained through respect and care. At night, when the scouts would settle at a respectful distance, the cabin regained its quiet intimacy. The girl and the man would sit together by the fire, sharing moments of laughter, teaching, and silent companionship. She would point to objects, gestures, or drawings, teaching him not just words but the meanings behind them. He would follow her guidance, learning to navigate her world with care and attention. In these quiet moments, their bond deepened further. She was no longer just the girl he had rescued. She was his partner, his guide, and in her cultural context, his wife. He felt the weight of responsibility that came with this role, but also a deep sense of honor. The wilderness outside was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, but inside the cabin there was safety, trust, and understanding. Yet even in the calm of the firelight, the man knew that challenges lay ahead. The world beyond the cabin would not always be accepting. Others might misunderstand their bond, question their intentions, or judge them unfairly. But he had learned one fundamental truth: trust, respect, and care were stronger than fear or prejudice. And as long as he honored these principles, he would continue to protect her, just as she had chosen to trust him. The girl, now fully recovered and confident in her surroundings, began to explore the cabin more freely. She moved with purpose, mimicking his actions in small, playful ways. She laughed easily, a sound that filled the room with warmth and reminded him of the life that could exist even in the harshest wilderness. He responded with gentle teasing, careful guidance, and patience, understanding that their relationship was now one of equals, bound by trust and shared experience. Days turned into weeks, and the scouts eventually departed, satisfied that the girl was safe and that her cultural bonds had been respected. The cabin returned to its previous quiet, but now it held a deeper meaning. It was not just a place of shelter. It was a home, a space where two lives had intertwined through courage, care, and understanding. As the sun set over the canyon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the man and the girl sat outside, looking at the horizon together. She reached out her hand and he took it gently. There were no words spoken, but in that moment they understood each other completely. Their journey had been marked by danger, trust, and discovery, and yet they had emerged stronger, their bond unbroken. In the wilderness, life was unpredictable, but they had found something rare and precious, a connection built on respect, compassion, and shared experience. And as night fell, the stars appearing one by one in the clear sky, they sat side by side, ready to face whatever challenges might come next together. The days after the scouts' departure were quiet, yet filled with a new energy that neither the man nor the girl had experienced before. The cabin, once a place of recovery and tentative trust, now held a sense of permanence and belonging. It was a home, not just a shelter. Outside, the canyon stretched endlessly, wild and untamed, but inside, life had found a rhythm, one built on care, respect, and shared purpose. The girl moved with confidence now, gathering water, tending the fire, and preparing small meals. Her wounds had fully healed, leaving only faint scars that told the story of her ordeal. But it was not just her body that had recovered. Her spirit had returned stronger than ever. She walked with pride, eyes alert and bright, and she smiled freely, laughter spilling from her heart in a way that brought warmth to the cabin and to the man who had come to care for her. He watched her closely, noticing every small movement, every gesture of curiosity, every thoughtful glance toward the horizon. Their bond, tested by fear, injury, and the scrutiny of her people, had only grown stronger. He had come to understand the weight of her declaration, her words and gestures that had named him as her husband in her culture. And he felt the deep responsibility that came with it, not a burden, but a privilege, an honor that he would carry with care and respect. They began to establish a routine together. Each morning, the man would rise early to tend the fire and fetch water, and she would follow shortly after, helping him and preparing simple meals. They shared the tasks of survival, from gathering firewood to tending small patches of edible plants near the cabin. But these duties were more than just chores. They were moments of connection, teaching and learning, laughter and patience. In these simple acts, they found joy, trust, and understanding. One afternoon, she surprised him. She had spent time outside, exploring the surrounding land, and returned with a small bundle of wildflowers. She placed them carefully on the table, then looked at him with a shy, hopeful expression. He understood immediately. She was sharing a gesture of affection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond between them. He smiled, gently taking her hand and squeezing it lightly. Their eyes met, and for a moment words were unnecessary. In that small exchange they spoke volumes, trust, care, and a growing love that transcended language and culture. Their days were filled with moments like this. Sometimes they would sit by the fire in the evenings, teaching each other new skills, sharing stories through gestures, drawings, and simple words. She taught him the names of the plants she used, the importance of certain rituals, and the ways her people communicated with nature. He, in turn, showed her how to track small animals, preserve food, and navigate the land safely. Every lesson, every shared moment, strengthened their connection. Yet the man knew that their life together would not be without challenges. The outside world was unpredictable. Other people might not understand their bond, might question it, or even attempt to separate them. But he had learned the value of patience, respect, and trust. He knew that by honoring her culture, her choices, and her spirit, they could face whatever obstacles came their way. And she, too, had learned to trust him fully, relying on his guidance and protection while sharing her own wisdom and strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky filled with shades of gold and crimson, she turned to him with a serious expression. Using gestures and the few words she had learned, she explained that she wanted to return to her people briefly, to show them that he had honored her and that their bond was recognized. The man understood immediately. He nodded, supporting her decision, knowing that this step was important not just for her family, but for the strength of their relationship. The next morning, they set out together, moving carefully through the canyon. The girl led the way, guiding him along familiar paths, pointing out landmarks, and ensuring that they avoided dangerous areas. The journey was slow, deliberate, but filled with shared observation and quiet conversation through gestures and sounds. When they finally approached her family's camp, her people were waiting. There was initial tension in the air, but she stepped forward confidently, placing herself between the man and her family. Using gestures and simple words, she explained the story of how he had rescued her, tended to her wounds, and protected her when she was most vulnerable. She made the gestures that had declared him her husband, repeating them clearly so that everyone could understand. The man stood respectfully, silent but attentive, showing through his actions that he understood the importance of this moment. Her family studied him carefully. They noted his calm demeanor, the care with which he had treated her, and the evident trust between them. Slowly their expressions softened. One by one they approached, offering nods of acknowledgement and words of cautious approval. The girl smiled, relief and pride shining in her eyes. She had proven that their bond was genuine, built on trust, respect, and care. In the days that followed, the man and the girl spent time with her family, learning more about their customs, their stories, and their way of life. He listened carefully, observing, asking questions through gestures, and showing respect for every tradition and rule. She guided him gently, translating through actions and words, ensuring that he honored her people while remaining true to the bond they shared. Through these interactions, the man realized that their life together would be a blend of two worlds. He would need to respect her culture, understand her customs, and navigate the expectations of her people. But he also knew that their bond was strong enough to endure these challenges. And the girl, confident in her choice, stood proudly beside him, guiding him, teaching him, and showing him that trust and love could bridge even the widest divides. Life began to settle into a rhythm. They returned to their cabin, now enriched by the knowledge of her family's traditions and the acknowledgement of their bond. They continued their routines, gathering food, tending the fire, exploring the land, but each day held a deeper meaning. Every shared meal, every small task, and every quiet moment together was a celebration of the journey they had taken, the challenges they had overcome, and the trust they had built. One afternoon, as they rested by the stream, she leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm gently around her, feeling the warmth of her body and the quiet certainty of her trust. They watched the water flow, the sunlight glinting off its surface, and shared a comfortable silence. Words were unnecessary. In that moment they were connected fully, their bond unspoken but unmistakable. Over time, they began to envision a future together. They spoke of small plans, planting a garden near the cabin, learning more of each other's ways, and perhaps even traveling together to explore the canyon and the surrounding lands. The girl's laughter returned fully now, bright and musical, and the man found himself smiling more often, feeling a contentment he had never known before. Yet even as they looked to the future, they never forgot the past. They remembered the fear, the danger, and the moment of rescue that had brought them together. They honored that memory through care, respect, and vigilance, ensuring that the trust they had built was never taken for granted. Their bond was forged in adversity, strengthened by understanding, and now affirmed by cultural acknowledgement and shared experience. One evening, as the stars filled the sky and the fire burned low, the girl spoke softly, her words a mixture of the few English phrases she had learned and her own language. She thanked him for saving her life, for protecting her, and for respecting her in every way. He smiled, touched her hand gently, and responded with words of his own, simple, heartfelt words that expressed what he had felt from the moment he first found her. In that quiet, starlit moment, they understood that their journey had only just begun. They had faced danger, fear, and cultural barriers, yet they had emerged stronger, their bond unshakable. The cabin was no longer just a place of shelter. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a symbol of the life they were building together. The girl, now fully healed and confident, looked at him with a mix of admiration, gratitude, and love. The man, in turn, gazed at her with respect, care, and an unspoken promise to protect and honor her for as long as he could. They had found each other in the midst of hardship and fear, and now they faced the future together, bound by trust, respect, and a deep, unbreakable connection. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, they sat together, side by side, ready to face whatever the world might bring. Outside, the canyon stretched endlessly, wild and unpredictable. But within the walls of their cabin, they had found something rare and precious, a bond forged in courage, nurtured in trust, and affirmed in love. And in that bond they had found home.